My parents splurged thousands of dollars on gifts for my sister's kids this New Year's Eve, while handing my son a cheap plastic toy from a gas station. When my dad told me to stay away because the family was better off without my defective child and me, I walked away peacefully, without shedding a single tear. 2 weeks later, my dad called begging for $15,000 to save his sinking lifestyle. I responded with one single sentence that left him completely speechless and destroyed his entire fake world. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who underestimated your worth. My name is Chelsea, 34 years old. To the corporate world in Chicago, I am the founder and chief executive officer of a premier forensic accounting and data analytics firm. My entire career is built on finding the truth hidden beneath layers of deceit. I track offshore accounts, uncover corporate embezzlement, and expose people who fund luxurious lifestyles with money they do not actually have. But to my family, I am simply the ultimate disappointment. They kicked me out of the house when I was 23 years old for becoming a single mother, claiming I had ruined their pristine suburban reputation. I spent the next decade building an empire from absolute scratch, working 80-hour weeks to provide a wonderful life for my child. They never bothered to learn what I actually do for a living. That ignorance would eventually become their most expensive and devastating mistake. The breaking point happened on New Year's Eve at my parents' sprawling estate in the affluent suburbs of Chicago. The house was a cathedral of fake wealth decorated to the extreme, reeking of expensive pine garlands and the desperate need to impress the neighbors. I had brought my 7-year-old son Leo to the family gathering, hoping for a relatively peaceful evening. Leo is a brilliant, sweet boy who happens to have mild attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. He gets overwhelmed by loud noises and sudden chaos, but he has a heart of absolute gold and tries so hard to be good. He sat quietly in the corner of the massive living room, his small hands folded neatly in his lap, trying his best to be invisible while the loud holiday festivities unfolded around him. The living room floor was buried under a mountain of torn premium wrapping paper and metallic ribbons. In the center of the room, my younger sister Brittany and her husband Donovan were loudly cheering on their 2 children. Donovan, a tall and imposing African-American man who always wore custom-tailored suits, presented himself to everyone as a highly successful venture capitalist. He clapped his hands loudly and boasted about his investment portfolios as his kids ripped open their presents. My parents, Richard and Susan, stood by the fireplace with beaming smiles of pride, completely ignoring my son in the corner. They had gone completely overboard for Brittany's children. I watched in silence as her kids tore into an absolute treasure trove of luxury items. There were 2 brand-new iPad Pros, heavy designer winter coats from Gucci Kids, and the grand finale was a miniature ride on Tesla car that drove straight into the living room. I did the mental math instantly. My parents had just dropped at least $2,500 on those 2 children in a single evening. Then my mother Susan walked over to the quiet corner where my son was sitting. She handed Leo a small, carelessly wrapped package that felt incredibly light. Leo smiled politely, said thank you, and carefully peeled back the thin paper. Inside was a cheap, flimsy plastic car. It was the exact kind of generic toy you find sitting in a dusty bin near the cash register at a highway gas station. It even had a faded yellow clearance sticker half peeled off the bottom, showing the price of $10. Leo did not complain or cry. He just rolled the little plastic wheels across the hardwood floor, perfectly content with what he was given. But the financial and emotional discrepancy in the room was so loud, it was absolutely deafening. I looked at my mother, waiting for some kind of explanation. Instead, Brittany walked over holding a crystal glass of champagne, her face twisted into a condescending smirk. She looked down at my son and let out a dramatic, theatrical sigh. You know, Chelsea, she said, her voice dripping with that fake sugary sweetness she always used when she was about to be exceptionally cruel. Private school kids really need high-end technology to keep up with their advanced curriculum. My kids are learning coding and digital art, so the iPads were an absolute necessity for their development. I kept my face perfectly neutral, refusing to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. Brittany took a sip of her drink and continued. We told Mom and Dad not to waste money on expensive things for Leo. I mean, with his condition, he cannot really focus on anything anyway. Giving him expensive electronics would be a total waste of money. He would probably just smash a screen during one of his little episodes. A cheap plastic toy is much safer for a child with his limitations. I felt a cold, sharp fury rising in my chest, but before I could speak, my mother chimed in. Susan smoothed down her expensive cashmere sweater and nodded in absolute agreement with her golden child. Brittany is right, Chelsea, my mother said, looking at me with thinly veiled pity. You really need to be realistic about his capabilities. We did not want to buy him something nice only to have it destroyed. Plus, Donovan and Brittany are doing so well, their children simply have different lifestyle expectations. It is just the reality of the situation. I did not scream, I did not cry. I stood there in the middle of their perfect living room and observed the absolute hypocrisy of the people who shared my blood. I looked at my father Richard, who was pretending to be a king while sipping top-shelf liquor. But my trained eyes saw a man who was sweating through his expensive dress shirt, forcing laughter while drowning in debt. I looked at Donovan, the smooth-talking venture capitalist, noticing the slight fraying on his cuffs and the nervous way he constantly checked his phone. My analytical mind was already piecing together the red flags they were all too blind to see. They thought they were humiliating the single mother who had disgraced their family name. They had absolutely no idea that I possessed the power to dismantle their entire fraudulent existence with a few keystrokes. I looked back at my beautiful son and made a silent promise to him. I would not engage in a screaming match. I would simply let their own arrogance and greed destroy them. Donovan walked over to the center of the room, the ice cubes in his expensive whiskey glass clinking loudly against the crystal. He adjusted his custom-tailored suit jacket with a practiced, arrogant motion, making absolutely sure the sleeve pulled back just enough to reveal the gleaming gold watch resting heavily on his wrist. It was supposed to be a Rolex Daytona. He paraded it around like a trophy of his immense success. However, I had seen enough hidden assets and luxury goods in my line of work to spot the subtle, undeniable flaws in the casing and the watch face. It was a remarkably good imitation, but an imitation nonetheless. To my parents, however, it was a blinding beacon of endless wealth and prestige. Donovan leaned comfortably against the polished marble fireplace, looking down at me with an air of absolute unearned superiority. He took a slow sip of his drink and let out a booming theatrical laugh that echoed off the high vaulted ceilings of my parents' living room. You know Chelsea? He began, his deep voice projecting across the room so that every single family member would be forced to listen. I saw you pull up in the driveway earlier in that old basic sport utility vehicle of yours. I am honestly surprised that tragic thing made it up the hill without completely breaking down and leaving you stranded. You really should let me give you some professional investment advice. A few smart, aggressive plays in the cryptocurrency market, and you could easily upgrade to something manufactured in this current decade. My kids cannot even ride in a vehicle that does not feature heated leather seats and a panoramic sunroof. It is all about building generational wealth, Chelsea. You have to spend money to make money. It is a mindset you clearly have not developed yet. He flashed a brilliant $1 million smile at my father, who nodded along in vigorous, enthusiastic agreement. My mother actually clapped her hands together, beaming at her son-in-law, as if he had just delivered a masterclass in modern economics. They were completely captivated by the shiny illusion he projected. The confident stance, the expensive fabric, the heavy gold watch. But my firm specialized in uncovering financial fraud, tracking offshore accounts, and destroying fake corporate empires. Donovan fit the psychological profile of a textbook scam artist, down to the microscopic details. I slowly stood up from the armchair, smoothing out the invisible wrinkles in my simple, unbranded black dress. I looked directly into his eyes, refusing to break contact or show even a fraction of intimidation. "That is incredibly generous of you to offer your high-level financial advice, Donovan," I said, my voice perfectly measured, calm, and slicing through the room like a freshly sharpened blade. "But I am actually a bit confused by your investment strategy. If your venture capital firm is generating such massive, unstoppable generational wealth for your family, why exactly were you texting me late at night last month, begging for a quiet, undocumented cash loan of $5,000 to cover a sudden business emergency?" The entire living room went completely dead silent. The holiday music playing softly in the background suddenly felt incredibly loud. The smug, condescending smile vanished from Donovan's face in an absolute instant. He swallowed hard, his throat bobbing nervously, and his eyes darted wildly toward my sister. Brittany gasped loudly, her face turning a deep, blotchy shade of red as she stared at her husband, waiting for a logical explanation that was never going to come. Donovan opened his mouth to speak, attempting to formulate a lie to save his crumbling facade, but only a sharp, embarrassed stutter managed to escape his lips. He was completely caught off guard, entirely exposed in front of the audience. He tried so desperately to impress. Before he could gather his thoughts, my father exploded. Richard slammed his heavy crystal glass down onto the mantel so hard I thought the thick glass would shatter into 100 pieces. His face morphed into a terrifying mask of pure, unfiltered rage. The veins in his neck bulged visibly as he stomped across the hardwood floor, aggressively placing himself directly between me and his precious son-in-law. "How dare you speak to him that way in my house?" My father roared, his voice shaking the decorative holiday ornaments hanging on the walls. "You come into my home on a holiday and try to publicly humiliate the only successful, respectable man your sister has ever brought into this family. You have absolutely no right to be jealous of the incredible life they have built together." He pointed a trembling, furious finger directly at my face, stepping so close I could smell the expensive, bitter bourbon on his breath. "Let us get one thing straight right now, Chelsea." He spat out, his eyes filled with burning contempt. 11 years ago, you got pregnant out of wedlock and disgraced this entire household. You dragged our good, respected family name through the mud with your irresponsible, reckless choices. We had to face our wealthy friends at the country club while you sat around playing the victim. And look at you now. You are still just a failed, struggling single mother, trying to get by driving a worthless car and acting bitter because you completely threw your life away before it even started. My father turned and gestured broadly toward Donovan, who was quickly recovering his arrogant, boastful posture behind my father's protective, towering shield. "Donovan is a real investor," Richard continued loudly. "He works with high-level capital. He brings actual class dignity and undeniable prestige to this family. He knows how to build a brilliant future, something you clearly know absolutely nothing about." Then my father did the one thing that crossed the final, unforgivable line. He looked down at Leo. My sweet, quiet son had stopped playing with his plastic car and was covering his ears with his small hands, absolutely terrified by the sudden, violent screaming echoing around him. My father sneered, his lip curling in disgust as he stared at his own grandson. "Keep your distance from Brittany's beautiful children," my father commanded, his voice dripping with pure venom. "I will not have your toxic, miserable attitude poisoning this joyful celebration. In fact, this house is infinitely better off without you and your defective child dragging all of us down. You do not belong here anymore." The echo of my father's cruel words hung in the suffocating air of the living room. Any other daughter might have shattered right there on the expensive Persian rug. Any other woman might have screamed, cried, or begged for a scrap of the parental love that was always dangled just out of reach. I did absolutely none of those things. A profound, frighteningly serene calm washed over my entire body. It was the absolute clarity of a woman who had finally realized that the bridge was not just burned, but completely reduced to unrecognizable ash. I did not waste a single breath arguing with a man who was already drowning in his own manufactured reality. I turned my back on Richard and walked slowly toward the corner where my son was shrinking into himself. Leo had his eyes squeezed tightly shut, his small shoulders trembling slightly under the weight of the sudden screaming. I knelt down gracefully, allowing my dress to sweep the floor, and gently placed my hands over his. When he opened his eyes, I gave him a warm, reassuring smile that belonged entirely to him, completely isolating him from the toxic venom radiating across the room. "It is time to go, sweet boy," I whispered, my voice steady and completely devoid of any anger or panic. "We are going to get some hot chocolate and go home." I stood up and helped him to his feet. I reached for his little navy blue winter coat resting on the nearby armchair and guided his arms into the sleeves. I buttoned it up with deliberate, methodical slowness, adjusting his collar and making sure he was perfectly warm. Behind me, the silence of the room was heavy, pregnant with the uncomfortable realization that their explosive drama had completely failed to provoke the hysterical reaction they so desperately craved. I was robbing them of their power simply by refusing to play the victim in their twisted family theater. My analytical mind was already cataloging their weaknesses, treating this entire disastrous gathering like one of my corporate fraud investigations. As I took my son by the hand and turned toward the grand entryway, my mother finally sprang into action. Susan could never handle a scene ending without having the absolute final word. Her designer heels clicked aggressively against the hardwood floor as she hurried after me, adjusting her diamond necklace as if preparing for a country club photo shoot. She blocked my path just inches from the heavy mahogany front door, her face contorted into a mask of bitter, self-righteous indignation. "You go right ahead and walk out that door, Chelsea," my mother sneered, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at my chest. "But let us get one thing perfectly clear. You made your bed 11 years ago, and you are going to lie in it. Do not think you can come crawling back here when your meager little life gets too hard. Go home and do not even think about showing your face around here begging for money in the new year. We have our own prestigious lives to maintain, and we are absolutely done financing your constant string of failures." I stopped with my hand hovering just above the brass handle of the front door. The sheer, unadulterated projection in her statement was almost poetic. She was warning me about begging for money, completely oblivious to the catastrophic financial avalanche currently speeding toward her beloved husband. I slowly turned around to face them one last time. Richard stood in the center of the living room with his chest puffed out, looking like a victorious king who had just banished a peasant. Donovan was smirking behind him while Brittany crossed her arms in triumph, basking in the glow of my supposed defeat. I looked directly into my father's eyes. I let the silence stretch for 5 agonizing seconds, watching the false bravado flicker ever so slightly under my unwavering ice-cold gaze. I wanted to burn this exact image into my memory, so I could recall it when the time came to collect what was owed. "Keep your pride, Richard," I said, my voice echoing through the grand foyer with the lethal precision of a judge delivering a final verdict. "Hold on to every single ounce of that arrogance, because in exactly 2 weeks, you are going to need it to pay your debts." The smirk instantly vanished from Richard's face. His entire body went completely rigid. For a fraction of a second, the mask slipped. I saw the raw, primal panic of a man who secretly knew his financial accounts were bleeding dry, terrified that someone else had finally figured it out. He took a short, unsteady breath, his eyes darting frantically as he tried to process the hidden meaning behind my words. But his massive, inflated ego quickly forcefully overrode his logic. He aggressively rolled his shoulders back, scoffing loudly to dismiss my warning as nothing more than the bitter parting shot of a jealous, defeated daughter trying to save face. "Get the hell out of my house," he barked, though his voice lacked the booming authority it carried just moments before. I did not give him the satisfaction of a second glance. I pushed the heavy mahogany door open, stepping out into the freezing, bracing winter air of the Chicago suburbs. The biting wind felt incredibly clean and refreshing compared to the suffocating toxicity I had just left behind. I held my son securely by the hand as we walked down the grand sweeping driveway, moving away from the sprawling estate that had always felt more like a prison than a home. Donovan had spent the entire evening mocking my supposedly worthless, broken-down vehicle. What he and my family failed to realize was that I never drove my personal car to their house because I refused to let them track my actual net worth. The vehicle waiting for me at the end of the driveway was not an old, struggling truck. It was a pristine, custom-ordered jet-black luxury SUV with heavily tinted windows, a vehicle that cost more than Donovan's entire fabricated investment portfolio. It was the quiet, undeniable hallmark of genuine corporate success. I opened the heavy rear door and gently helped Leo climb inside, buckling him safely into his premium leather seat. The interior was warm, quiet, and perfectly insulated from the chaos of the outside world. I closed his door, letting out a long, steady breath that turned into a cloud of white mist in the freezing night air. The physical act of closing that car door felt like closing the final chapter on my entire childhood. As I walked around to the driver's side, I cast one final sweeping look at the massive, brightly lit suburban mansion. Through the large bay windows, I could see them returning to their expensive champagne and their hollow, superficial conversations, desperately pretending everything was absolutely perfect. They had no idea that the ticking time bomb resting underneath their entire luxurious existence had just been activated. I slid behind the steering wheel, started the powerful engine with a quiet, satisfying hum, and smoothly drove away into the dark night. I left them to enjoy their final days of blissful, ignorant wealth, knowing exactly what was waiting for them when the calendar finally turned. 2 weeks passed in the blink of an eye. The bitter cold of the Chicago winter battered against the reinforced glass windows of my corner office on the 40th floor, but inside the climate was perfectly controlled. My workspace was a reflection of the empire I had built from absolute scratch. Polished steel, dark mahogany, and wall-to-wall monitors displaying the intricate financial data of our corporate clients. Vanguard Forensic Accounting was not just a successful firm. We were the silent executioners of the financial district hired by major banks to track down hidden assets and dismantle the lives of white-collar criminals. I sat comfortably in my high-back leather chair, holding a steaming cup of black coffee, reviewing the latest batch of margin call reports. Life was incredibly peaceful when you removed the poison from your daily routine. I was just about to approve a forensic audit when the private line on my mahogany desk began to ring. It was a restricted number one I only gave to high-level clients and elite legal counsel. I glanced at the caller identification screen and felt a cold, sharp smile slowly form on my lips. The name flashing across the digital display was Richard, my father. The timing was absolutely impeccable. I knew this phone call was coming. I had anticipated it down to the very hour. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee, letting the phone ring 3 times to establish dominance before I finally reached out and pressed the speaker button. The glowing green light illuminated on the console, filling my expansive office with the heavy, expectant silence from the other end of the line. Chelsea. "Are you there, sweetheart?" The voice that echoed through the high-definition speaker was so incredibly jarring I almost did not recognize it. It was not the booming, aggressive roar of the tyrant who had screamed at my terrified 7-year-old son on New Year's Eve. It was not the arrogant, condescending tone of the suburban king who had told me I was a disgraceful failure who did not belong in his pristine mansion. No, this voice was sickeningly sweet, dripping with a desperate manufactured affection that made my stomach churn with absolute disgust. It was the soft, pleading voice of a drowning man. "I am here, Richard," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly level, completely devoid of any warmth or familiarity. "Oh, wonderful. It is so good to hear your voice, my beautiful daughter." My father continued forcefully, injecting a hearty, jovial chuckle into the conversation. His fake laughter sounded incredibly strained, echoing hollowly through the speaker. "I know we have not spoken since the holidays, and I just wanted to call and check on you. How is my favorite girl doing? How is my little grandson Leo? I hope he is enjoying the new year." The sheer, unadulterated audacity of the man was genuinely breathtaking. He was acting as if the catastrophic explosion in his living room had never even happened. He was completely erasing the memory of him looming over my child, calling him defective, and ordering me out of his house. It was classic narcissistic behavior rewriting history to suit his current immediate needs. He expected me to simply fall in line and play the role of the dutiful, forgiving daughter. "We are doing exactly as well as we were 2 weeks ago," I stated coldly, refusing to give him an inch of emotional ground. "State your business, Richard. I have a company to run, and my time is billed at a very high premium." There was a long, uncomfortable pause on the other end of the line. I could vividly picture him standing in his lavish suburban kitchen, loosening his expensive silk tie, sweating profusely as he realized his usual charm offensive was crashing into a solid brick wall. When he finally spoke again, the fake joviality had thinned out, revealing the raw, undeniable panic vibrating just beneath the surface. "Well, Chelsea, the truth is, I am calling because we have a slight family situation," my father murmured, his tone dropping into a conspiratorial, intimate register. "The commercial real estate market has been a little sluggish this month. You know how these economic cycles go. Ebb and flow, nothing serious. Just a temporary bottleneck in cash flow. Your mother and I find ourselves dealing with a tiny, frustrating liquidity issue." I leaned back in my chair, steepled my fingers together, and stared out at the sprawling Chicago skyline. I remained absolutely silent, forcing him to endure the agonizing weight of his own awkward explanation. I knew if I waited long enough, his desperation would force him to get straight to the humiliating point. I was hoping, my father stammered, clearing his throat nervously. "I was hoping my successful daughter might be able to help her old man out of a minor jam. We need a temporary loan, just $15,000. It is a drop in the bucket, really. I will pay you back with interest the moment my next big property deal closes next week. You know my word is perfectly solid." I let the number hang in the air between us. $15,000. It was such a specific, pathetic lie. I stared at the glowing financial dossier currently open on my computer monitor, observing the exact catastrophic truth of his ruined financial empire. He was trying to maintain his dignity, asking for a small, manageable amount so he would not look like a complete failure. He was still trying to protect his precious ego while begging the daughter he despised for a financial lifeline. "Family must always help family during tough times," Chelsea, my father, pleaded, his voice taking on a pathetic, whining quality. "We have to stick together when the world gets complicated. I know things got a little bit heated during the holiday party, but we are blood. You are not still holding a grudge about that silly little misunderstanding, are you? We all say things we do not mean when we are stressed. It is all water under the bridge, right?" He was actually demanding that I sweep his abusive behavior under the rug. He wanted me to hand over my hard-earned money and simultaneously absolve him of all his sins. The psychological manipulation was so transparent, it was almost insulting to my intelligence. I sat in my quiet, powerful glass office, looking down at the city below, feeling absolutely nothing but clinical, calculating detachment. The trap was set, the target had willingly walked right into the center of it, and all that was left for me to do was pull the lever. I reached across the polished expanse of my mahogany desk and firmly pressed the glowing speaker button on my console. The digital click echoed sharply through the quiet, climate-controlled air of my executive suite. I wanted his voice to fill the room, completely detached from my physical space, isolating his desperation so I could examine it like a specimen under a microscope. I took a slow, deliberate breath, allowing the silence to stretch just long enough to make the tension on the other end of the line entirely unbearable. $15,000. I repeated, my voice perfectly flat, reflecting absolute zero emotion. "That is an incredibly fascinating number, Richard, but I have to admit I find myself deeply confused by the logistics of your request. You just spent an entire holiday evening declaring how useless I am. You proudly announced to a crowded room that your son-in-law is an elite financial genius who brings unmatched prestige to your household. So tell me, why exactly are you calling the defective single mother daughter you just threw out into the freezing cold? Why do you not simply ask your brilliant high-rolling venture capitalist son-in-law for the cash? Where exactly is Donovan and his immense generational wealth now that you suddenly need a pathetic little bailout? The reaction was instantaneous. The sickeningly sweet fake joviality that Richard had been projecting completely evaporated, instantly replaced by the harsh, abrasive edge of a man whose fragile ego had just been struck with a sledgehammer. I could hear his breath hitch a sharp intake of air, followed by a heavy, frustrated sigh. His sudden pivot from begging to extreme irritation was a textbook narcissistic response to being challenged. "Do not bring Donovan into this!" Richard snapped, his voice rising in pitch, completely shedding the gentle father persona he had tried to wear just a minute ago. Donovan is managing highly complex portfolios. His capital is currently tied up in a massive high-yield offshore investment fund right now. You cannot simply liquidate those kinds of premium institutional assets overnight just to cover a minor temporary cash flow issue. Real investors understand how liquidity works. You would know that if you actually understood high-level finance instead of just holding on to your petty little grudges. I sat back in my leather chair, staring at the panoramic view of the Chicago skyline, utterly unfazed by his aggressive tone. He was regurgitating financial buzzwords he likely heard Donovan throw around at dinner parties, stringing together meaningless phrases like high-yield offshore funds to mask the fact that his golden son-in-law was utterly useless. When his attempt to sound financially superior failed to elicit a response from me, Richard immediately resorted to his favorite, most worn-out weapon. He shifted directly into brutal, heavy-handed psychological manipulation. "You are my daughter," Richard growled, the anger now vibrating violently through the speakerphone. "Would it literally kill you to help your own parents out of a temporary bind? Is this how you repay us? We put a roof over your head. We fed you, we raised you, and now when we ask for one tiny, insignificant favor, you throw it back in our faces. Are you really going to be this ungrateful, unfilial child? Are you actually going to sit there and watch your family struggle just to satisfy your own bitter, vindictive ego?" Before I could even formulate a response to his ridiculous, entirely fabricated guilt trip, a second voice suddenly broke onto the line. There was a sharp click, followed immediately by the sound of dramatic, theatrical sniffing. It was my mother. Susan had clearly been hovering right next to him, listening to the entire exchange on another extension, waiting for her specific cue to enter the stage. "Chelsea, please!" Susan cried out, her voice trembling with an expertly crafted, manufactured sorrow. She let out a loud, shuddering sob that echoed through my office, a performance designed specifically to trigger every single ounce of childhood conditioning I had ever possessed. "Do not do this to your father. He is under so much terrible stress right now. The market has been so incredibly cruel to him lately." I listened to her weep, observing the complete lack of genuine emotion in her performance. There were no real tears behind that voice. It was a calculated, strategic, emotional assault. For 34 years, that exact tone had worked flawlessly. That fake, trembling cry used to make me abandon my own needs, empty my own pockets, and scramble to fix whatever mess they had created, just to earn a fleeting, temporary fraction of their approval. "We are family. Chelsea." Susan continued, her voice reaching a high, desperate pitch as she laid the guilt on as thickly as humanly possible. "We are supposed to love and protect each other. You cannot just turn your back on your own flesh and blood over a silly, meaningless argument at a holiday party. We are begging you. Brittany and Donovan have their own young children to worry about. They cannot carry this burden. You are the only one who can help us right now. Please just wire the money. Have a heart. Do not be so cold and cruel to the mother who gave you life." I rested my hands on the cool mahogany surface of my desk. 10 years ago, the combined weight of Richard's screaming demands and Susan's hysterical crying would have broken my spirit entirely. I would have felt the crushing, suffocating weight of obligation. I would have scrambled to my bank account, desperate to prove my worth, desperate to show them I was a good, loyal daughter who deserved a seat at their table. But the woman sitting in this glass office was not the broken, desperate 23-year-old girl they had banished from their pristine suburban kingdom. I was an apex predator in the financial ecosystem. I dealt with sociopathic corporate embezzlers and ruthless money launderers on a daily basis. I had built a psychological fortress around my mind that was completely impenetrable to their cheap, transparent, emotional extortion. I let Susan's fake sobbing fill the room for a few more seconds. I listened to Richard heavily breathing in the background, both of them waiting anxiously for me to crack, waiting for me to submit to their coordinated attack. They honestly believed their coordinated routine of rage and tears was wearing me down. They thought I was sitting here feeling guilty, preparing to surrender my hard-earned capital to save their ridiculous hollow status. They had absolutely no idea that their entire performance was nothing more than highly entertaining background noise to the absolute execution I was about to deliver. I let my mother continue her theatrical, breathless sobbing for exactly 15 more seconds. I wanted them to fully exhaust their emotional ammunition to completely empty their pathetic arsenal of psychological manipulation before I dropped the absolute crushing reality of their situation directly onto their heads. I leaned forward in my ergonomic leather chair and placed my hands over the mechanical keyboard resting on the pristine surface of my polished mahogany desk. The rhythmic, sharp clicking of the keys echoed clearly into the speakerphone as I bypassed the standard security protocols and accessed the deeply restricted, highly classified financial database my investigative team had compiled earlier that very morning. My eyes tracked slowly across the glowing dual monitors, scanning the catastrophic bleeding red numbers that represented my father's entire fraudulent existence. The screen displayed a complex, damning labyrinth of toxic commercial loans, desperate shell company transfers, and utterly depleted retirement accounts. It was a digital graveyard of his own making. They honestly thought they were talking to an emotional, vulnerable daughter they could easily bully into submission. They had absolutely no idea they were actively negotiating with their financial Grim Reaper. "Susan," I said, my voice slicing through the heavy air with the cold, sterile precision of a surgical scalpel. "You can stop crying right now. The performance is completely unnecessary, and frankly, it is incredibly insulting to my intelligence." The fake weeping on the other end of the private line ceased instantly, cut off abruptly, as if someone had flipped a physical switch in their grand suburban kitchen. A heavy, suffocating silence immediately replaced the manufactured tears. Richard loudly cleared his throat, desperately attempting to regain his footing, preparing to launch another aggressive volley of angry, entitled parental demands. But I did not give him the space to take a single breath. "I am not going to give you $15,000, Richard," I stated, enunciating every single syllable with absolute terrifying clarity. "I am not going to wire you a single dime of my hard-earned capital. But more importantly, I need you to understand exactly why your request is so incredibly pathetic. You are lying to me, Richard. You are lying to yourself. You do not need $15,000 to fix a minor liquidity issue." I scrolled further down the digital forensic dossier, my eyes locking onto the primary devastating figure highlighted in bright red at the absolute bottom of the screen. I leaned much closer to the high-definition speakerphone, ensuring my voice carried the full, undeniable weight of authority. "I know you do not need $15,000 because I am currently looking directly at the exact, undeniable mathematical truth of your ruined life. You need exactly $142,500, and you do not need it next week or next month to smooth over a rough quarter. You need that exact amount wired to Vanguard National Bank before 5 o'clock this afternoon to cover a massive catastrophic margin call on your severely over-leveraged commercial properties. If that specific amount is not deposited into their institutional holding account in exactly 4 hours and 20 minutes, the bank will initiate immediate aggressive foreclosure proceedings. They will seize the commercial lots, they will freeze your remaining depleted checking accounts, and they will place a hard, inescapable lien on that pristine, luxurious suburban mansion you love significantly more than your own children. You are not experiencing a minor cash flow bottleneck, Richard. You are completely, hopelessly, and utterly bankrupt. The silence radiating from the speakerphone was absolute and profound. It was the heavy, breathless, terrifying void of an arrogant man who had just been stripped completely naked in the middle of a crowded room. I could vividly picture the blood rapidly draining from my father's face, his expensive smartphone trembling violently against his ear as the world collapsed around him. I could easily imagine my mother standing frozen next to him, her jaw dropped in sheer, unadulterated terror as the polished, glittering illusion of their wealthy country club lifestyle shattered into a million irreparable pieces right before her eyes. The grand facade was entirely gone forever. When Richard finally managed to force a sound past his constricted vocal cords, it was not his usual booming roar of anger. It was a weak, pathetic, trembling gasp of pure defeat. How Richard stammered, his voice cracking and breaking painfully under the crushing, undeniable weight of exposure. "How do you know that? Nobody knows that. The bank assured me this was strictly confidential. How do you possibly have those exact numbers?" I allowed a slow, dark, deeply satisfying smile to spread across my face. I looked out at the sprawling, magnificent Chicago skyline, beyond my floor-to-ceiling glass walls, feeling the absolute intoxicating rush of total, undeniable victory coursing through my veins. Because Richard, the banking industry does not trust failing, desperate men who lie continuously about their financial assets. When Vanguard National Bank realized your commercial portfolio was built entirely on a weak foundation of fraudulent projections and toxic debt, they did exactly what every major financial institution does. They hired an elite independent forensic accounting firm to tear your life apart thoroughly, audit your bad debts, and prepare the ironclad legal documentation for total asset seizure. They hired Vanguard Forensic Accounting. They hired my company. I am the lead auditor, legally executing the financial termination of your entire estate. I paused, letting the devastating, inescapable reality of my words sink deep into his marrow, knowing it was destroying him from the inside out. "You told me on New Year's Eve that I was a massive failure who did not belong in your prestigious world. You were right about one thing, Richard. I do not belong in your world. I own it. Good luck finding $142,000 before 5 o'clock. You are going to desperately need it, you absolute loser." I firmly pressed my index finger against the glowing red button on the console, severing the connection instantly. The speakerphone went dead, leaving my corner office bathed in absolute, magnificent, triumphant silence. The fallout from my phone call did not take long to manifest in the real world. In modern suburban America, when cornered narcissists lose their grip on reality and face absolute financial ruin, they immediately weaponize social media to control the narrative. Less than 48 hours after Richard missed his catastrophic margin call and officially defaulted on his massive commercial loans, my personal smartphone transformed into a vibrating beacon of digital harassment. It started late on a Friday evening with a sudden avalanche of notifications across every single platform. I sat at my kitchen island, sipping a glass of iced water, while Leo was safely asleep upstairs, completely shielded from the incoming toxicity. I unlocked my screen and found myself staring directly into the dark, desperate underbelly of my family's psychological warfare. Brittany and Susan had launched a highly coordinated, viciously fabricated smear campaign across Facebook and several exclusive suburban community groups. My mother, playing the role of the devastated matriarch, posted a lengthy, tear-jerking narrative to her country club circle. She claimed that I had maliciously hacked into their secure bank accounts and stolen their entire retirement savings to fund my own lavish, selfish lifestyle in the city. She painted a pathetic, entirely fictional picture of Richard working himself to the bone for decades only to be financially decimated by his greedy runaway daughter. Brittany took it a massive step further, She shared our mother's post into 3 different neighborhood watch groups and 4 local parenting forums with thousands of active suburban members. Brittany added her own venomous commentary, calling me a sociopathic thief who had abandoned the family out of pure spite. But the absolute worst part, the fatal mistake that guaranteed my total lack of mercy going forward, was the specific paragraph Brittany dedicated to my beautiful 7-year-old son. She publicly wrote that Leo having a neurological condition was divine retribution. She typed the words out for the entire world to read, stating that his mild attention deficit hyperactivity disorder was a direct punishment from God, absolute karma, for my supposed sins against the family. She claimed I was an unfit, unstable mother who was actively destroying her child's future while simultaneously robbing her elderly parents blind to pay for my corporate wardrobe. The digital echo chamber reacted exactly as my family had meticulously planned. The flying monkeys descended instantly. My inbox flooded with hateful, vitriolic messages from extended relatives, old high school acquaintances, and nosy suburban neighbors I had not spoken to in over a decade. My father's older brother sent a scathing text message calling me a disgusting criminal who deserved to be locked in a federal prison for elder abuse. A woman who used to attend the same country club yoga class as my mother left a rambling, threatening voicemail declaring that I was a complete disgrace to womanhood and that Child Protective Services should be called immediately to rescue Leo from my incredibly toxic environment. The notifications piled up rapidly, hundreds of angry digital voices, blindly believing the tragic manufactured narrative of a perfect loving family victimized by a rogue villainous daughter. Any normal person might have panicked under the weight of such a massive public attack. Any other woman might have immediately drafted a frantic, emotional public response, desperately trying to defend her character, posting screenshots of bank statements to prove her absolute innocence, or begging the community to listen to the actual truth. I did absolutely none of those things. I did not shed a single tear. I did not feel a single ounce of shame or embarrassment. I simply felt the cold, hard, calculating thrill of a seasoned hunter watching her prey blindly wander directly into a steel trap. Every single post, every shared link, every hateful comment, and every threatening text message was systematically captured. I sat in the quiet comfort of my home and methodically took high-resolution screenshots of the entire coordinated smear campaign. I archived the precise digital timestamps. I downloaded the abusive voicemails and backed them up to a secure cloud server. I preserved every single piece of their unhinged defamatory breakdown with the clinical precision of a professional forensic investigator. They honestly believed they were ruining my professional and personal reputation in the community. They had absolutely no idea they were actively handing me a massive, undeniable mountain of legally binding evidence for a slam-dunk defamation and cyber harassment lawsuit. They were willfully digging their own financial and legal graves in real time. I placed my phone flat on the cool granite countertop. I did not engage. I did not block them. I allowed the digital poison to continue flowing freely into my archives, knowing that their arrogance would only push them to post even more highly incriminating statements. My mind was completely clear, focused entirely on the overarching strategy. They had played their absolute worst card, thinking extreme social pressure would force me to surrender and wire them the money to save my public image. They severely underestimated my resilience and fundamentally misunderstood the exact nature of the war we were fighting. I picked up my secure work phone and dialed a familiar number. The line rang twice before being answered by a sharp, authoritative voice. Ms. Kensington was working late as she always did. She was a ruthless, brilliant attorney who viewed corporate and civil litigation not as a job, but as a highly competitive blood sport where only the absolute strongest survived. "Good evening, Chelsea," Ms. Kensington answered smoothly. "I assume by the timing of this call that the primary targets have finally reacted to the margin call default." "You assume correctly," I replied, my voice echoing evenly in the quiet kitchen. "They have chosen the predictable, emotionally volatile route. They are currently staging a massive, highly defamatory public meltdown across multiple social media platforms. They are actively accusing me of grand larceny, elder abuse, and openly targeting my young son with malicious written statements. I have already secured and archived every single digital footprint for our records. Ms. Kensington let out a low, deeply satisfied hum of approval. Defamation, libel, and documented public harassment. How wonderfully cooperative of them to provide the exact leverage we needed for the upcoming asset acquisition. Shall I prepare the cease and desist orders immediately? Neither, I stated firmly, looking out the kitchen window into the dark, freezing Chicago night. Let them continue to post their ridiculous lies. Let them feel victorious and righteous for a few more days. We never interrupt an enemy who is busy making a massive, fatal mistake. I paused, feeling the absolute, undeniable power of the corporate empire I had built standing firmly behind me. I took a slow, steady breath, calculating the precise trajectory of my next devastating move against them. Ms. Kensington, I commanded softly, ensuring my tone carried absolute, unwavering authority. The digital evidence is entirely secured. It is time to initiate the next phase of the financial takeover. Start reeling in the net. The following morning, I arrived at the Vanguard Forensic Accounting headquarters long before the sun even considered rising over Lake Michigan. The digital smear campaign executed by my mother and sister was still raging wildly across the suburban internet, but I had entirely tuned out their desperate, frantic noise. My focus had shifted to a much more lucrative, devastating target. If my father Richard was the rapidly sinking ship, I needed to know exactly who drilled the massive holes in his hull. I assembled my elite team of senior data analysts in the secure glass-walled conference room at exactly 7:00. I projected a single photograph of Donovan onto the massive digital display board. It was a picture Brittany had posted just a few days ago, showing her husband grinning arrogantly in his custom suit, flashing that heavy gold watch. I instructed my team to completely bypass the superficial social media illusions and dive straight into the brutal, undeniable realm of public data, credit histories, and corporate employment records. I wanted the financial autopsy of my golden brother-in-law completed before my morning coffee turned cold. The forensic investigation did not even take a full hour. When you strip away the designer clothing and the confident, booming voice, financial realities are incredibly easy to decode. My lead analyst, a brilliant woman who specialized in unmasking corporate fraudsters, walked into my office and placed a thick, heavily documented file directly onto my mahogany desk. The very first page of the dossier struck the initial fatal blow to Donovan's entire fabricated existence. The man was not a venture capitalist. He had never managed a high-yield offshore investment fund. He had never directed institutional capital. Exactly 8 months ago, Donovan had been unceremoniously terminated from a mid-level advisory position at a minor, struggling boutique firm. He was fired for cause, and that specific cause was the gross misappropriation of company funds. He was a common, everyday embezzler who had barely managed to avoid a federal indictment by signing a strict non-disclosure agreement and quietly vacating the premises. He had been entirely unemployed, utterly devoid of any legitimate income for nearly a year. I sat back in my leather chair, my eyes scanning the heavily redacted termination documents, processing the sheer, unadulterated audacity of the man. For 8 months, he had been waking up, putting on a tailored suit, and pretending to go to a high-powered executive job while actively bringing $0 into his household. But that immediate revelation instantly spawned a much larger, more terrifying question. If Donovan was a disgraced, unemployed fraudster, how exactly was he financing his incredibly lavish lifestyle? How was he paying for Brittany's endless designer shopping sprees? How did he afford to casually drop $2,500 on a miniature Tesla and luxury iPads for his children on New Year's Eve? I directed my team to follow the digital money trail. In the world of forensic accounting, the money always tells the absolute, unfiltered truth. We bypassed his maxed-out delinquent personal credit cards and began tracing the origins of his recent massive cash deposits. It only took a few precise algorithmic searches to uncover the horrifyingly simple, beautifully poetic source of his fake wealth. The money trail did not originate from a brilliant business deal. It did not come from a lucrative stock dividend. The massive bleeding financial pipeline led directly, unequivocally, straight into Richard's personal retirement accounts. The digital footprints painted a picture of a classic, devastatingly effective affinity scam. Donovan had used his position as the beloved, highly respected son-in-law to completely manipulate my father. Richard, a man who possessed immense arrogance but severe financial illiteracy, had been the perfect willing victim. The records showed a series of massive, panicked liquidations from Richard's secure long-term retirement portfolios occurring over the last 6 months. The funds were quietly transferred under the guise of an aggressive guaranteed return investment strategy in emerging cryptocurrency markets. Donovan had convinced my father that he possessed insider knowledge of a digital coin offering that would multiply their generational wealth tenfold. However, those heavily liquidated retirement funds never reached a single cryptocurrency exchange. They never entered the digital market. They were systematically funneled through a basic, transparent shell company and dropped directly into Donovan's private checking accounts. The revelation was almost too perfect to believe. My father had literally financed his own family's fake superiority. The expensive custom suits Donovan wore to intimidate me were bought with my father's retirement money. The fake Rolex watch he proudly flaunted in our faces was purchased with Richard's liquidated assets. And the most sickeningly poetic detail of all was that the extravagant $2,500 Christmas gifts used to publicly humiliate my disabled son were paid for by the very man who was currently defaulting on his commercial loans. Richard was completely bankrupt, facing the imminent, devastating loss of his suburban mansion and his entire commercial real estate portfolio because he had handed his financial lifeline directly to a charming, well-dressed parasite. My father had allowed his own blind prejudices to be overridden simply because Donovan fed his massive ego and promised him a shortcut to ultimate wealth. They had ostracized me, the actual financial expert, while rolling out the red carpet for a criminal who was actively bleeding them dry from the inside out. I closed the heavy file folder, feeling a profound, terrifying sense of power vibrating through my hands. Brittany and Susan were currently spending their days aggressively typing hateful, defamatory lies about me on the internet, desperately trying to protect their pristine suburban image. They were fiercely defending a man who had actively stolen their future to buy them shiny, meaningless toys. They were living in a fragile, highly combustible house of cards, and I was currently holding the only match. I picked up my secure phone and dialed Ms. Kensington. I told her to prepare a massive, undeniable evidence binder. The time for quietly watching from the shadows was officially over. We were going to take this irrefutable proof directly into the daylight. The digital clock on my desktop monitor ticked relentlessly toward 5 o'clock in the afternoon. I sat perfectly still in my high-back leather chair, watching the live institutional trading portal connected directly to Vanguard National Bank. The flashing numbers on the screen represented the brutal, unforgiving reality of the corporate financial ecosystem. My father had been given a strict, non-negotiable deadline to wire exactly $142,500 to cover his catastrophic margin call. I knew with absolute mathematical certainty that he did not possess that capital. He had drained his retirement accounts to fund Donovan and his fake investments. The seconds melted away, and the digital clock struck 5. Instantly, the status indicator next to Richard's massive commercial loan portfolio shifted from a warning yellow to a blinding terminal red. The system automatically triggered a catastrophic default status. He had failed. Vanguard National Bank immediately initiated the aggressive foreclosure protocols, stripping him of all financial protections and moving his severely over-leveraged debt directly to the distressed asset auction block. The sprawling suburban mansion my parents worshipped more than their own flesh and blood was no longer a symbol of their elite country club status. It was now simply a toxic, distressed asset, waiting to be liquidated to the highest bidder. I reached for my secure private phone and dialed my lead corporate attorney. Ms. Kensington answered on the very first ring, anticipating my precise instructions. The default status has been officially triggered, I stated, my voice reflecting the cold, clinical atmosphere of my glass-walled office. Vanguard National Bank has formally listed the residential collateral on the distressed asset exchange. My father is completely bankrupt, and the suburban estate is currently vulnerable. Ms. Kensington let out a low, sharp hum of professional approval. The paperwork is entirely prepared, Chelsea, she confirmed, her tone radiating ruthless legal efficiency. We have established the anonymous shell company strictly according to your specific parameters. Apex Holdings is fully funded and legally insulated from any personal connections to your identity or Vanguard Forensic Accounting. We are ready to execute the hostile acquisition the moment you give the green light. I stood up from my desk and walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the sprawling Chicago skyline. This was the exact moment the balance of power permanently shifted. Execute the acquisition immediately, I commanded, ensuring my voice carried the absolute weight of a seasoned corporate predator. Do not let this debt linger on the open market for a single second. Offer Vanguard National Bank a premium cash buyout for the entire outstanding loan portfolio, including the primary residential mortgage. They will gladly accept an immediate liquid cash injection over dealing with a lengthy, complicated foreclosure process. I will submit the binding electronic offer right now, Ms. Kensington replied, the sound of rapid, precise typing echoing through the secure connection. Vanguard relies heavily on quick capital recovery for their bad debts. Purchasing this specific portfolio through an untraceable limited liability company ensures your parents will have absolutely no idea who actually holds their financial execution order until the very last possible moment. The beauty of the American corporate legal system is that massive wealth provides ultimate legal invisibility. Apex Holdings would appear on paper as just another faceless, aggressive investment firm sweeping up toxic suburban debts for a quick, massive profit. Richard and Susan would assume they were dealing with a ruthless banking conglomerate, entirely unaware that the newly appointed executioner was the very daughter they had banished into the freezing winter night. I waited in the quiet sanctuary of my office, watching the digital portal as the complex financial mechanisms churned in the background. My elite team of specialized analysts had already run the predictive models, confirming that no other institutional buyer would ever move fast enough to outbid a premium cash offer submitted within minutes of the initial default listing. The transaction was a highly calculated, perfectly executed surgical strike designed to trap them entirely without giving them any chance to escape the impending ruin. Exactly 24 minutes later, a secure encrypted email notification pinged loudly on my primary monitor, breaking the intense silence of my office. I opened the highly classified digital folder sent by Miss Kensington and stared intently at the heavily documented legal confirmation. The transaction was officially complete and binding. The massive wire transfer had cleared the institutional holding accounts perfectly, and Vanguard National Bank had legally transferred the full deed of trust and all associated debt instruments directly to Apex Holdings. I slowly exhaled, feeling a profound, terrifying surge of absolute authority coursing through my veins. The transition of power was legally binding and entirely irreversible. I was no longer just a successful forensic accountant watching from the distant city skyline. I was officially the supreme primary creditor, holding the absolute legal rights to the sprawling suburban estate my parents called home. I literally owned the roof over their heads, the manicured lawn they used to impress their superficial friends, and the heavy mahogany front door they had slammed in my face 11 years ago. They had spent 3 decades treating me like an unwanted burden while desperately trying to maintain a flawless facade of generational wealth. Now their entire existence rested securely in the palm of my hand. They were living on borrowed time inside a house they no longer owned and sleeping in beds that belonged exclusively to me. I picked up my phone to deliver my final critical instruction for the long-anticipated day. "Ms. Kensington," I said softly, a dark, victorious smile spreading across my face as I watched the sun begin to set over the frozen city. "Prepare the formal eviction notice. Keep it absolutely legally ruthless and ready for immediate deployment. The time for silent observation is officially over. We are going to let them perform their desperate little charade for a few more days before we completely obliterate their fake world." The Sunday morning brunch at the Oak Ridge Country Club was a masterclass in American suburban hypocrisy. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over tables draped in heavy white linen. Waiters in crisp black vests circulated the dining hall carrying silver trays loaded with imported caviar and bottomless mimosa flutes. The air was thick with the suffocating scent of expensive floral perfumes and the hollow echoes of industrial practiced laughter. It was the absolute pinnacle of elite society, a sanctuary where the ultra-wealthy gathered to flaunt their status and judge anyone who fell below their impossible tax brackets. Right in the center of this glittering illusion sat my parents. Richard and Susan had booked the premier private dining alcove, hosting a lavish, spectacularly expensive gathering they could not actually afford. They were performing the roles of their lives, masking the terrifying reality that they were entirely, completely bankrupt. Richard stood near the carving station with a plate of prime rib he had no intention of eating. He wore his best tailored navy blazer, but the fabric under his arms was already damp with cold, terrified sweat. I watched the live security feed from my tablet courtesy of a private investigator I had hired to monitor their public meltdown. Richard aggressively cornered William, an elderly, highly successful commercial developer who had known our family for decades. Richard clamped a heavy hand on William's shoulder, projecting that fake booming confidence he used to intimidate people. He leaned in close, lowering his voice into a conspiratorial whisper. Richard was desperately attempting to secure a massive private bridge loan, disguising his frantic begging as an exclusive limited-time investment opportunity in a fictional commercial plaza. He smiled broadly, exposing his perfectly whitened teeth, while his eyes darted around the room with the frantic trapped energy of a cornered animal. Susan was actively working the other side of the room, kissing cheeks and complimenting designer dresses, desperately trying to gauge if any of her wealthy friends had heard rumors about their catastrophic financial default. While my parents were fighting for their social survival, Donovan was completely in his element. My brother-in-law glided smoothly between the linen-covered tables, projecting the ultimate image of a brilliant, unstoppable venture capitalist. He wore a sharp custom-fitted charcoal suit completely paid for by the very retirement funds he had actively drained from my father. The fake gold Rolex peeked out from his cuff as he gestured wildly, painting elaborate, entirely fictional pictures of massive financial returns. He had cornered a group of wealthy retired doctors near the champagne fountain. Donovan was smoothly pitching a ghost project, a phantom artificial intelligence startup that absolutely did not exist. He threw around complex tech buzzwords with complete confidence, charming the older men into believing they were getting ground floor access to the next billion-dollar digital empire. He was actively hunting for new victims to fund his fraudulent lifestyle, entirely unaware that my forensic team had already forwarded his complete criminal embezzlement dossier to the federal authorities. Brittany stood proudly by her husband's side, playing the role of the devoted affluent wife to absolute perfection. She held a fresh glass of champagne in one hand and casually rested her other hand on her designer leather handbag. She wore a brand new, glaringly expensive diamond tennis bracelet, a piece of jewelry that I knew for a fact was purchased using the heavily liquidated assets stolen directly from our father's retirement account. She paraded it around the room, making sure the brilliant overhead lighting caught the stones, entirely ignorant that she was essentially wearing the physical manifestation of her parents' imminent homelessness. She laughed musically at all of Donovan's fabricated jokes, basking in the envious stares of the older country club wives. The level of cognitive dissonance required to maintain such an elaborate charade was genuinely staggering. Every single bite of expensive food they swallowed, every sip of premium alcohol they consumed was being charged to credit lines that were mere hours away from being permanently frozen by federal fraud investigators. The sheer unadulterated audacity of their performance was almost admirable in a deeply twisted sociopathic way. They were sipping premium imported champagne and eating fresh oysters while standing on a financial trapdoor that I had already completely unhinged. I sat in the plush leather seat of my armored luxury vehicle parked exactly 2 blocks away from the country club entrance, monitoring the audio and video feeds. My investigator was transmitting directly to my secure tablet. I listened to my father confidently promise a 30% return on an investment property he no longer legally owned. I listened to Donovan casually ask an elderly surgeon for a minimum buy-in of $50,000 for a tech company that did not even have a registered tax identification number. They were digging their graves deeper and wider with every single syllable that left their mouths. The atmosphere inside the club was a carefully curated symphony of deception. The soft classical music playing from the grand piano in the corner perfectly masked the desperate rapid beating of Richard's failing heart. Susan laughed loudly at a terrible joke told by a prominent local politician, throwing her head back and pretending she did not have a care in the world. But I could see the rigid tension in her neck. I could see the way her eyes constantly scanned the room, terrified that a bank representative or a collections agent might suddenly walk through those heavy oak doors. They were functioning on pure adrenaline and absolute denial. It was a fascinating psychological study of narcissistic self-preservation. They would rather spend their absolute last borrowed dollar putting on a lavish brunch for people who secretly despise them than admit to their own daughter that they had completely destroyed their lives. The brunch slowly dragged on into the late morning. The opulent displays of wealth surrounding them served as a stark, mocking contrast to the devastating reality waiting for them at home. The country club manager, a sharply dressed man with a clipboard, discreetly approached Richard near the buffet line. I watched closely as the manager politely but firmly requested a valid credit card to keep on file for the heavily mounting open tab, noting that Richard's primary account had unexpectedly declined earlier that morning. Richard's face instantly drained of color, his fake smile freezing into a tight, panicked grimace. He quickly pulled out a different card, one of his last surviving lines of high-interest credit, and handed it over with a forced, dismissive chuckle, blaming a simple banking error. The cracks in their pristine armor were finally beginning to show, spreading rapidly across the surface of their fabricated reality. The stage was perfectly set. The audience of elite judgmental peers was fully seated and paying close attention. It was the exact undeniable moment I had been patiently waiting for. I turned off the tablet, placed it gently on the leather seat beside me, and signaled my driver to pull the vehicle forward. The time for silent observation was officially over. The heavy oak doors of the Oak Ridge Country Club swung open with a muted thud. I stepped over the polished brass threshold, leaving the freezing Chicago winter behind me. The air inside was thick with the scent of roasted prime rib and expensive floral arrangements. I wore a tailored charcoal blazer, completely stripping away the vulnerable single mother image my family loved to project onto me. Flanking my right side was Miss Kensington, clutching a sleek leather briefcase that contained the absolute destruction of my father's financial existence. Walking behind us were 2 broad-shouldered process servers, dressed in immaculate dark suits. They moved with the cold, silent efficiency of men who delivered ruin for a living. The string quartet playing in the grand lobby seemed to fade into the background as my heels clicked rhythmically against the marble floor. We moved past the antique mahogany reception desk without breaking our stride. The young hostess in her pristine uniform opened her mouth to ask for a membership reservation, but one sharp, icy look from Ms. Kensington instantly silenced her. We walked with the undeniable gravitational pull of supreme authority, parting the sea of wealthy suburbanites who turned their heads to stare at our formidable procession. I navigated the corridors of the dining hall, tracking the exact location of the premier private alcove my investigator had pinpointed. The soft clinking of silver cutlery against fine china filled the vast space, but I was focused on the specific table at the far end of the room. There they were basking in the golden glow of the crystal chandeliers. Richard was aggressively pitching his phantom commercial real estate investments to a captive audience of elderly doctors. Donovan was grinning, showing off his fake gold watch while pouring premium champagne for potential victims. Brittany was tossing her highlighted hair, playing the role of the affluent, carefree wife. And Susan, my mother, was scanning the room, making sure every single person in the club noticed their lavish, heavily leveraged display of wealth. They were completely immersed in their delusion, utterly unaware that the financial executioner had just entered their sacred sanctuary. I rounded the final velvet stanchion and stepped directly into their line of sight, bringing my legal entourage to a sudden, synchronized halt right at the edge of their white linen table. Susan was the first person to spot me. She had a glass of mimosa halfway to her lips when her eyes locked onto my face. The glass slipped from her manicured fingers, tipping forward and spilling a sticky orange puddle across the immaculate tablecloth. Her jaw dropped, exposing the sheer panic hiding beneath her layers of expensive foundation. The entire table fell dead silent. Richard stopped his desperate pitch mid-sentence, his face contorting into a mask of pure, unfiltered outrage. Brittany grabbed Donovan's arm, her lips parting in sudden shock. Susan scrambled to her feet so fast her heavy wooden chair scraped against the polished floor, creating a screeching noise that echoed across the dining hall. "What in the world are you doing here?" Susan hissed, her voice vibrating with a mixture of terror and disgust. She pointed a trembling finger directly at my chest, desperately trying to maintain her matriarchal dominance in front of her wealthy country club peers. "You have absolutely no right to step foot inside this establishment. This is a highly exclusive private club for respectable families. You do not even have a basic membership card, you piece of ungrateful trash." Susan did not stop there. Her panic rapidly morphed into an unhinged, frantic superiority. She waved her hand in the air, signaling for the club security personnel standing near the buffet station. Manager Susan screamed, abandoning her refined country club persona. "Get the manager right now. I want these trespassers removed from our brunch immediately. Call the police if you have to. I will not allow this pathetic, bitter woman to ruin our prestigious family gathering." My father, Richard, stood up slowly, puffing out his chest to intimidate the two process servers standing behind me. He buttoned his navy blazer, attempting to project the illusion of control. "Chelsea, you have exactly 10 seconds to turn around and walk out those doors before I have you arrested for trespassing and harassment." Richard growled, his face turning a shade of crimson. I did not blink. I did not flinch. I did not offer a word of explanation or apology. Instead, I calmly reached into the interior pocket of my designer handbag. My fingers brushed against the cold, solid metal of the card resting inside. I pulled it out with agonizing slowness. It was not a standard plastic entry pass. It was a heavy, matte, black titanium card engraved with gold lettering. I raised my hand and casually tossed the metal card directly onto the center of their dining table. It landed with a sharp, heavy thud right next to Richard's plate of prime rib. The general manager of the Oak Ridge Country Club, a sharp-eyed man who had been rushing over to answer my mother's screaming, suddenly slammed on his brakes. He pushed past a confused waiter and stared down at the black titanium card resting on the white linen. It was the exclusive VVIP shareholder credential. It was a card completely unavailable for public purchase, reserved strictly for the elite board of directors and the primary financial stakeholders, who essentially owned the actual land the club was built upon. The manager's face drained of all color. He immediately straightened his posture, smoothing his suit jacket, and completely ignored my mother's continued shouting. He stepped around my terrified parents and bowed deeply, respectfully from the waist directly toward me. "Good afternoon, Miss Chelsea," the manager said, his voice trembling with absolute, unwavering deference. "We are profoundly honored to have you visiting the club today. Please accept my deepest apologies for the disturbance. Is there absolutely anything you require from the staff to make your inspection of the property more comfortable?" Richard and Susan instantly turned a ghostly shade of pale, their eyes wide with absolute horror, as the crushing reality of my supreme authority finally hit them. The club manager bowed once more and quickly vanished into the background, leaving an absolute suffocating vacuum of silence around the table. Richard and Susan were physically paralyzed, their brains utterly failing to process how the daughter they had violently discarded was now the ultimate authority in their most sacred suburban sanctuary. I did not linger on their terrified faces. My primary target for this specific moment was sitting right next to them. I slowly turned my gaze toward Donovan. The smooth, arrogant venture capitalist persona he had been broadcasting all morning was rapidly beginning to fracture. He shifted uncomfortably in his custom-tailored suit, instinctively pulling his cuff down to hide that pathetic counterfeit gold watch. He tried to project a casual, dismissive smile, but the muscles in his jaw were visibly twitching. He knew I was a forensic accountant. He knew exactly what kind of lethal digital weaponry I possessed. I nodded slightly to Ms. Kensington. She stepped forward with the cold precision of a predator and unlatched her sleek leather briefcase. She pulled out a remarkably thick, heavy red folder and placed it directly into my waiting hands. The file contained the complete, unfiltered financial autopsy of the man my father worshipped. I raised the folder high enough for the entire table to see, then slammed it down onto the center of the white linen cloth with a thunderous cracking impact that made the crystal champagne flutes violently rattle. The loud noise acted like a massive magnet, drawing the intense, undivided attention of the wealthy retired doctors, local politicians, and elite business partners sitting at the adjacent tables. I opened the cover, exposing a mountain of heavily highlighted bank statements, wire transfer receipts, and court-ordered debt collection notices. "Let us talk about your massive, unstoppable generational wealth, Donovan," I began, my voice projecting clearly across the silent dining hall. "Let us discuss the specific, highly complex investment portfolios you were just actively pitching to these respectable doctors." I pulled a glossy bank statement from the top of the stack and tossed it directly onto his empty porcelain plate. "Can you explain to your captive audience why a supposedly elite fund manager currently possesses a negative personal liquidity ratio? Can you perhaps elaborate on the phantom equity you promised my father? Or why your primary checking account has been overdrawn for exactly 240 consecutive days?" Donovan stared down at the highlighted numbers, a thick bead of cold sweat suddenly forming on his forehead. He opened his mouth desperately, searching for a sophisticated financial buzzword to deploy, but his vocal cords completely seized. "You told Richard you were moving his liquidated retirement assets into a high-yield secure offshore cryptocurrency exchange." I continued, stepping closer to the table dominating the physical space. "But forensic data routing does not lie, Donovan. I tracked every single penny of that transfer. The capital never reached a digital coin offering. It bypassed the market entirely and was wired directly into a holding account managed by a massive underground casino operation. You did not invest my father's life savings. You gambled it all away on high-stakes tables in a single pathetic weekend." The color completely vanished from Donovan's face. His dark skin took on a sickening ashen pallor. The heavy gold imitation watch on his wrist suddenly seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds as his hands began to visibly tremble against the white tablecloth. He looked frantically at Richard, then at the wealthy investors standing nearby, producing nothing but a series of pathetic, broken, stammering sounds. He was suffocating under the crushing weight of absolute public exposure. Seeing her husband completely cornered and rapidly deteriorating, my sister Brittany suddenly sprang up from her chair. Her face was twisted into a mask of ugly, desperate fury. She slammed her hands down on the table, desperately trying to protect the fragile, luxurious illusion she had built her entire identity upon. "You are a psychotic, jealous liar!" Brittany shrieked, her voice cracking hysterically, shattering the refined atmosphere of the country club. Donovan is a brilliant, successful executive. You are just a bitter, lonely woman trying to destroy our perfect marriage because you have absolutely nothing going for yourself. He manages millions of dollars in corporate capital. I did not raise my voice. I did not match her frantic, unhinged energy. I simply reached back into the red folder and pulled out a single crisp piece of official corporate stationery, bearing the distinct, recognizable logo of Donovan's former employer. I held it up between my index and middle finger, letting the bright chandelier light illuminate the bold, undeniable text. Managing Corporate Capital. I repeated softly, my tone dripping with lethal calculated irony. That is a very fascinating way to describe gross, premeditated embezzlement. I flicked my wrist, tossing the termination letter directly into Brittany's chest. It fluttered down and landed perfectly face up on her lap. Read it aloud, Brittany. Read the exact legal termination clause from 8 months ago. Read the part where your highly successful husband was unceremoniously fired for cause stripped of his security clearance and forced to sign a strict non-disclosure agreement to avoid a federal grand jury indictment for stealing corporate funds. He is not a venture capitalist. He is a disgraced, unemployed fraudster who has been waking up every morning, putting on a suit, and pretending to go to a job that absolutely does not exist. Brittany stared down at the termination letter, her eyes wildly scanning the legal text. Her breathing became shallow and rapid as the horrifying, undeniable truth finally shattered her delusional reality. She looked at Donovan, waiting for him to snatch the paper away and declare it a forgery, but he remained slumped in his chair, completely paralyzed by his own public execution. The reaction from the surrounding crowd was instantaneous and utterly devastating. The wealthy doctors, the elite investors, and the prominent local politicians who had been eagerly listening to Donovan's pitch just moments ago began to physically recoil. They murmured in hushed, disgusted tones, exchanging alarmed glances as they rapidly comprehended the massive financial bullet they had just dodged. They actively turned their backs, stepping away from the table, as if Richard and his family were suddenly infected with a highly contagious lethal disease. The prestigious social standing my parents had spent 3 decades meticulously cultivating evaporated into thin air in less than 3 minutes. They were no longer the elite, respected members of the Oak Ridge Country Club. They were a pathetic, bankrupt family, harboring a known documented criminal completely exposed in the center of the very room they worshipped. The heavy silence in the dining hall was suddenly shattered by a harsh, desperate bark of laughter. Richard, realizing that his entire social circle was actively backing away from his table, made one final agonizingly pathetic attempt to salvage his completely pulverized reputation. He aggressively puffed out his chest, straightening his tailored navy blazer with violently shaking hands. He pointed a trembling, sweat-slicked finger directly at my face, his eyes wide with a frantic, unhinged energy. "You are absolutely insane, Chelsea!" Richard roared, his voice cracking violently under the immense, crushing pressure of his own collapsing reality. "Do not listen to a single word this deranged woman says. She has been deeply unstable for years. She is just a bitter, psychotic daughter trying to create a massive public spectacle because we rightfully cut her out of our prestigious lives. She is fabricating all of these ridiculous documents just to ruin our lovely Sunday brunch because she is hopelessly jealous of our success." Richard looked around wildly at the retreating doctors, the local politicians, and the elite investors desperately trying to catch someone's eye, seeking anyone who would validate his frantic, transparent lies. "We are a highly respected family. We have impeccable credit. We are pillars of this community. This is nothing but a pathetic, hysterical stunt by a woman who desperately needs immediate psychiatric help." I did not even blink at his desperate, flailing accusations. I did not raise my voice to argue. I simply took a half step back, smoothing the front of my charcoal blazer, and allowed Ms. Kensington to take the absolute center stage. The veteran corporate attorney moved with the terrifying, inevitable grace of an executioner stepping up to the block. She did not raise her voice, nor did she display even a fraction of emotional investment. She simply unclasped the secondary compartment of her sleek leather briefcase and withdrew a thick, legal-sized envelope sealed with heavy red wax. She walked directly up to Richard, her high heels clicking sharply against the polished marble floor, and thrust the heavy envelope squarely against his chest. When he instinctively raised his hands to catch it, she stepped back, leaving him holding his own absolute financial demise. That is an emergency writ of foreclosure and a formal notice of immediate asset seizure, Ms. Kensington announced, her voice perfectly calibrated to carry across the breathless, silent dining hall. As of 5 o'clock yesterday evening, your primary commercial loan portfolio officially entered terminal default status due to your complete failure to meet a mandatory margin call of $142,500. Consequently, your primary residential estate, all associated collateral, and all frozen capital accounts have been permanently seized by your new primary creditor. Richard stared down at the thick legal envelope in his hands, as if it were a live ticking explosive device. His mouth opened and closed in rapid, silent succession. The fake, booming confidence he had wielded like a weapon his entire life evaporated, instantly replaced by the raw, undeniable terror of a man plunging into a bottomless abyss. He frantically tore open the heavy wax seal, his hands shaking so violently that the thick parchment papers rattled loudly in the quiet room. His bloodshot eyes darted frantically across the complex legal jargon, desperately searching for a loophole, a clerical error, any tiny shred of hope. He read the official declaration of total bankruptcy. He read the notice of immediate residential eviction. And then his eyes locked onto the bold black ink identifying the sole acquiring entity that had aggressively purchased his toxic debt directly from Vanguard National Bank. Apex Holdings Limited Liability Company. He read the name of the primary shareholder authorizing the aggressive takeover. His head snapped up, his face drained of every single drop of blood, turning the color of dirty, wet ash. The cognitive dissonance completely shattered in his mind. He looked at the legal document, and then he looked directly into my eyes. The absolute horror dawning on his face was the most beautiful, satisfying masterpiece I had ever witnessed. "Is it you?" Richard whispered, his voice completely stripped of all its former arrogant power, reduced to a fragile, broken gasp. "Are you Apex Holdings? Are you the one doing this to us?" I stood perfectly still under the glittering crystal chandeliers of the Oak Ridge Country Club, absorbing the sheer, unadulterated magnitude of my total victory. For 34 years, this man had dictated my worth. He had banished me into the freezing night, called my brilliant son defective, and worshipped a hollow materialistic illusion over his own flesh and blood. Now he was entirely at my mercy, stripped of his fake wealth, his fake friends, and his fake pride. I looked down at him, a man who was rapidly shrinking into a pathetic hollow shell of his former self. "Yes, Richard," I replied, my voice ringing out with absolute undeniable finality. "I bought your toxic debt. I own your commercial lots. I own your frozen bank accounts. And most importantly, I own the very roof over your head." I smiled, a slow, freezing expression that contained absolutely zero warmth. "Welcome to the world of failures." The impact of those words hit the table like a physical shockwave. Susan let out a sharp, breathless wail, her knees completely buckling beneath her. She collapsed heavily into her expensive dining chair, clutching her pearl necklace as she hyperventilated her pristine, carefully crafted country club image, utterly annihilated. Brittany buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably, as the reality of her husband's criminal exposure and her parents' sudden catastrophic poverty crashed down upon her. Donovan remained perfectly frozen, his eyes wide and vacant, staring blankly at the table as he realized his free ride was permanently terminated and federal prison was highly imminent. They were completely surrounded by the elite wealthy society they worshipped above all else, and they had just been publicly, ruthlessly slaughtered. The surrounding club members did not offer a single word of sympathy. They merely watched the spectacle with cold, detached disgust, silently crossing Richard and Susan off their exclusive social registries forever. The illusion was dead. I did not stay to watch them weep. I had delivered exactly what I promised on New Year's Eve. I gave Miss Kensington a brief, satisfied nod. We turned in perfect unison and began our walk back through the grand dining hall. The sea of wealthy patrons parted for us immediately, offering a wide, respectful path for the woman who had just executed the most brutal, flawless financial takedown in the history of their prestigious club. The heavy oak doors swung open for us, and I stepped back out into the freezing, bracing Chicago air. The sky was bright and incredibly clear. I walked toward my waiting black luxury vehicle, leaving my toxic, broken family to suffocate in the ruins of the fake, pathetic kingdom they had built for themselves. The luxurious ride back from the Oak Ridge Country Club was a suffocating, terrifying funeral march. My private investigator had already strategically positioned a highly sensitive covert audio surveillance device hidden deep inside their sprawling suburban estate weeks ago, allowing me to listen to their spectacular, inevitable implosion from the absolute comfort of my secure downtown office. The heavy mahogany front door, the very same intimidating door they had proudly slammed in my face on New Year's Eve, clicked shut behind them with a dreadful finality. The silence inside the grand, vaulted foyer lasted for exactly 10 agonizing seconds before the fragile, meticulously crafted illusion of their perfect family violently detonated. The air in the house, previously thick with the scent of expensive candles and arrogant superiority, instantly turned utterly toxic and hostile. They were no longer the elite, untouchable royalty of the wealthy neighborhood. They were cornered, desperate rats trapped in a rapidly sinking luxury vessel, and their immediate primal instinct was to viciously tear each other apart just to survive the impending wreckage. Donovan was the very first to strike. The smooth, charming venture capitalist persona he had weaponized to brilliantly infiltrate my family vanished completely instantly, replaced by the ruthless, desperate cornered criminal he truly was. He aggressively ripped off his custom-tailored suit jacket and threw it carelessly onto the pristine white sofa. He did not offer a single word of apology to the older man, whose entire life savings he had callously incinerated at underground casino tables. Instead, he immediately pivoted his aggressive defensive strategy, aiming his toxic vitriol directly at the woman standing trembling beside him. He pointed a hostile, shaking finger at Brittany, his voice echoing fiercely off the high vaulted ceilings. "This is your fault," Donovan roared, his booming voice entirely stripped of all its former refined elegance. "Do not look at me like I am the sole villain here. You are the one who constantly demanded the imported cars, the endless luxury vacations, and the massive designer shopping sprees. You practically forced me to drain your father's accounts just to maintain your pathetic, delusional lifestyle." Brittany backed away, her eyes wide with sheer, unadulterated horror as the man she had proudly paraded around the prestigious country club actively threw her directly under the speeding bus. "You knew exactly what my salary was." Donovan continued, stepping aggressively toward her, forcefully backing her into the expensive marble fireplace. "You knew perfectly well that I lost my advisory position 8 months ago, but you absolutely refused to cut back on your outrageous spending. You threw a massive, childish tantrum when I suggested we fly commercial instead of chartering private jets for the holidays. You demanded those ridiculous $2,500 gifts for the kids just to prove you were vastly superior to your struggling sister. I had to secure massive amounts of capital to keep your psychotic, greedy delusions afloat. I took the retirement funds because your relentless, suffocating financial demands left me absolutely no other choice." The sheer audacity of his victim-blaming finally snapped Brittany's fragile, manicured composure. Her face contorted into a terrifying mask of pure, unhinged fury. She let out a piercing, hysterical scream that reverberated sharply through the surveillance audio feed. "You lying, manipulative parasite!" she shrieked at the top of her lungs, hot tears of pure humiliation streaming down her face and completely ruining her expensive makeup. She lunged forward with explosive, unpredictable violence. Her hand sliced rapidly through the air, delivering a vicious, resounding slap directly across Donovan's face. The sharp cracking sound of her palm striking his cheek echoed violently in the empty, foreclosed mansion. Donovan did not even flinch. He simply stood there, a dark, mocking sneer twisting his handsome features, looking down at the woman he had completely financially ruined with absolute chilling contempt. He had extracted every single drop of wealth from their family, and now that the well was permanently dry, he was discarding her without a fraction of hesitation. Richard witnessed this entire brutal, revealing exchange from the center of the living room. The booming, tyrannical patriarch who had mercilessly banished me into the freezing winter night was completely paralyzed. His mind brutally replayed the humiliating realization that the sophisticated African American businessman he had proudly elevated above his own flesh and blood was nothing more than a parasitic con artist. He had actively alienated his brilliant, successful daughter and handed the absolute keys to his kingdom to a man who had systematically stripped him of every last existing penny. The crushing, undeniable weight of his colossal arrogance finally physically manifested. Richard let out a sudden, agonizing gasp, his hands flying up to violently clutch his chest. The color completely drained from his face, turning a sickly, translucent shade of gray. His knees buckled instantly, and he collapsed heavily onto the expensive white sofa, his breathing turning into rapid, shallow wheezes as he experienced a severe stress-induced cardiac panic attack. The empire he had built on a foundation of lies was literally stopping his heart. Yet in a display of breathtaking sociopathic narcissism, Susan completely ignored her husband, clutching his chest in agonizing pain. She did not rush to his side. She did not attempt to call an ambulance or offer a single word of maternal comfort. Her entire existence was solely tethered to her elite social standing, and she knew that status was currently bleeding out on the country club floor. Susan frantically pulled her designer smartphone from her purse, her hands shaking so wildly she could barely tap the glowing screen. She desperately began dialing the numbers of the wealthy doctors' wives, the prominent local politicians, and the elite socialites she had just been sharing imported caviar with mere hours earlier. She paced the length of the grand foyer, holding the phone tightly to her ear, silently praying for anyone to answer and validate her crumbling existence. The phone rang continuously, the dial tone echoing mockingly into her ear. Call after call went directly to automated voicemail systems. The elite society she worshipped had already completely excommunicated her. News of the dramatic, highly public financial execution at the Oak Ridge Country Club had spread through their exclusive network faster than a blazing wildfire. She was no longer Susan, the wealthy, respected suburban matriarch. She was highly radioactive, a toxic, bankrupt pariah that no one wanted to be associated with under any circumstances. She dropped the phone onto the hardwood floor, finally sliding down the wall and burying her face in her hands. The massive, sprawling estate was filled with the sounds of Brittany's hysterical sobbing, Richard's labored, agonizing wheezing, and Donovan's cold, dismissive footsteps as he walked upstairs to pack his bags. They were entirely hopelessly trapped in a personal hell of their own meticulous design, locked inside a house that officially belonged to me. The brutal Chicago weather seemed to perfectly mirror the catastrophic destruction of my parents' lives. A torrential, freezing rain battered against the towering glass facade of the Vanguard Forensic Accounting headquarters. It was a miserable, relentless storm that washed away the dirt of the city and swallowed the weak. From the warmth of my executive suite on the 40th floor, I received a highly anticipated call from my chief of security. The notification was brief and entirely pathetic. Two soaking wet, frantic individuals claiming to be my parents were currently blocking the primary corporate security checkpoint down in the main lobby. They had bypassed the outer perimeter and were actively causing a massive, desperate scene at the reinforced glass turnstiles. The towering, majestic skyscraper I owned felt like a fortified, impenetrable castle, and the peasants were finally clawing at the heavy iron gates, begging for a microscopic drop of mercy. I did not rush. I took my time finishing my cup of hot, dark coffee, ensuring every single movement I made was dictated by my own schedule and absolutely no one else. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored charcoal blazer, stepping onto the high-speed private elevator that descended smoothly toward the ground floor. My mind was perfectly clear, completely devoid of any residual childhood guilt or biological obligation. The time for familial negotiations had permanently expired the moment they allowed a fraudulent criminal to drain their accounts while simultaneously attempting to destroy my disabled son. When the polished silver elevator doors quietly glided open, I stepped into the vast, echoing expanse of the corporate lobby. The space was a monument to elite financial power constructed entirely of cold Italian marble and thick bulletproof security glass. Standing on the outside of the final security barrier entirely exposed to the harsh elements pouring in through the revolving front doors, were Richard and Susan. The visual contrast was genuinely staggering. The wealthy, arrogant suburban royalty who had mercilessly banished me into the winter night just weeks ago were now completely physically and emotionally obliterated. Richard was wearing the same navy blazer from the country club, but it was now entirely soaked through, hanging heavily on his rapidly shrinking frame. His perfectly styled hair was plastered wildly against his forehead, and his expensive leather shoes were ruined by the freezing puddles accumulating on the lobby floor. He was gripping the thick security turnstile, violently shaking it, while aggressively arguing with my stoic, heavily armed security personnel. Next to him, Susan was an absolute catastrophic mess. The elite country club matriarch, who cared only about expensive perfumes and prestigious social registries, was openly weeping in a public corporate lobby. Her expensive designer mascara ran down her pale cheeks in thick, dark streams, mixing with the freezing rain dripping from her chin. She clawed frantically at the thick security glass, crying out to the impassive guards, "Please, you have to let us upstairs!" Susan wailed, her voice echoing shrilly across the marble floor. "You do not understand the situation. We are her family. I am her mother. She is my own flesh and blood. You cannot keep a mother away from her own daughter when her family is completely falling apart. We just need 5 minutes to speak with her. She will listen to us because a mother and a daughter share an unbreakable bond. Blood is thicker than water. Please just pick up the phone and tell her that her parents are freezing and begging for her help." The security guards did not flinch, did not speak, and did not move a single muscle. They were highly trained professionals who only answered to me. I walked slowly across the pristine marble floor, stopping exactly 3 feet away from the reinforced glass barrier. I did not step through the security gates. I remained safely, securely inside my protected fortress, looking out at the 2 desperate drowning figures, clawing at the invisible wall, separating our 2 entirely different worlds. Susan spotted me first. Her eyes widened with wild, desperate hope, and she slapped both of her wet, trembling hands flat against the thick glass. "Chelsea." Susan screamed, her voice muffled but perfectly audible through the heavy security barrier. "Oh, thank God you came down. Chelsea, please, you have to call off the corporate lawyers. You have to stop the eviction process immediately. Your father had a severe panic attack yesterday. We have absolutely zero money left in our accounts. Donovan took every single penny we ever saved and completely vanished into thin air. We have nowhere else to go. We are your parents. You cannot legally throw us out onto the street like stray dogs. You have to show some mercy." Richard pushed himself forcefully against the glass, standing right beside his weeping wife. "Chelsea, listen to me." Richard pleaded, his voice entirely stripped of the booming, tyrannical authority he had wielded my entire life. "We made a massive, catastrophic mistake. We trusted the wrong man, and we were completely blinded by his lies. But we are incredibly sorry. We are begging you to forgive us. You have the ultimate power to reverse this entire nightmare. You can buy the house back for us. You can restore our accounts. You are a brilliant, successful woman, and you can easily afford to fix this family. We promise things will be entirely different from now on." I stood perfectly still, my posture straight, my expression colder than the freezing rain pounding against the building exterior. I looked into the desperate, terrified eyes of the man who had called my beautiful, innocent boy defective. I looked at the woman who had proudly told me never to show my face begging for money. I reached forward and pressed the small silver button on the security console, activating the two-way external intercom system. My voice projected clearly and loudly into the cold, echoing lobby, cutting through their pathetic weeping like a razor-sharp scythe. "I am not going to fix your mistakes, Richard," I stated, my tone completely hollow, entirely drained of any human sympathy. "I am not going to reverse the legal eviction, and I am absolutely not going to fund your fake, pathetic lifestyle ever again. You gambled your entire existence on a charming criminal because you valued superficial prestige more than you valued actual loyalty. You threw me out into the cold, and now you get to experience exactly how freezing the real world truly is." Susan sobbed uncontrollably, sinking to her knees right there on the hard, wet marble floor. "Chelsea, please," Susan begged, pressing her tear-stained face against the bottom of the glass. "You cannot do this. We will die out there. We are your family." I looked down at the pathetic, broken woman kneeling in the puddles of rainwater. I leaned closer to the microphone, delivering the final lethal psychological blow. "I am simply granting your greatest holiday wish, Susan," I whispered softly into the intercom, ensuring every single devastating syllable landed perfectly. "Do you not remember the exact words you screamed at me on New Year's Eve? You said this house is infinitely better off without me." I smiled, a dark, terrifyingly calm smile. "You were absolutely right. My house is much better off without you inside it." I released the intercom button, instantly severing the audio connection. I did not wait to watch them scream silently behind the soundproof glass. I turned my back on the people who had given me life and walked smoothly away, my heels clicking rhythmically across the pristine marble floor, heading back to my high-speed elevator, leaving them completely permanently locked outside in the freezing, unforgiving storm. The sleek silver elevator doors slid shut with a quiet, definitive thud, entirely severing my visual connection to the pathetic, drenched figures of Richard and Susan. The high-speed cabin propelled me upward, returning me to the serene, climate-controlled sanctuary of the 40th floor. I felt absolutely no residual guilt. My heart rate remained perfectly steady, completely unaffected by the hysterical weeping I had just left behind in the cold marble lobby. I walked back into my spacious corner office, the panoramic view of the freezing Chicago storm serving as a perfect cinematic backdrop to my calculated victory. I sat down at my massive mahogany desk, smoothing the sleeves of my tailored charcoal blazer, and immediately pressed the secure intercom button to summon my lead corporate attorney. Miss Kensington entered my office less than 60 seconds later. She moved with the lethal, silent grace of an apex predator circling wounded prey. Her immaculate designer suit was perfectly pressed, a stark, brilliant contrast to the miserable, soaking wet mess my parents had become downstairs. She carried a sleek, digital tablet, her sharp eyes locking onto mine, waiting for the precise operational command she knew was inevitably coming. "They are currently weeping at the security perimeter," I stated, my voice echoing with pure, unfiltered authority. "Richard and Susan are begging for a miraculous financial resurrection. They honestly believe their theatrical tears will magically erase decades of emotional abuse and financial negligence. They are desperately clinging to the delusion that biological ties will somehow override a legally binding commercial foreclosure." Miss Kensington offered a razor-thin, terrifyingly professional smile. "Desperation always makes the initial impact of total bankruptcy significantly harder for the debtors to process," she noted smoothly. "Shall I instruct the building security personnel to forcibly remove them from the premises? We can easily involve local law enforcement if they refuse to vacate the lobby and continue to cause a public disturbance." I shook my head, slowly formulating the final crushing phase of their destruction. "No," I commanded, my tone dropping into a completely emotionless clinical register. Having them dragged out by the police would only feed their ridiculous victim complex. It would allow them to spin a fake narrative about being brutalized by a ruthless corporation to their country club friends. I want to break them legally, methodically, and entirely by their own hand. "I want you to go down to the lobby, Ms. Kensington. You will act as my sole proxy. I will not grant them another second of my personal time or emotional energy." Ms. Kensington nodded, her posture straightening as she prepared to execute my will. "What exact parameters are we setting for this encounter, Chelsea?" she asked, tapping her digital pen against the screen. "Tell them I am willing to offer a single non-negotiable lifeline," I instructed, leaning back in my heavy leather chair. "Tell them I am offering a final agreement." Use those exact words. It will give them a microscopic, pathetic glimmer of hope. They will instantly assume I am going to bail them out, save their precious suburban mansion, and completely restore their elite social status. Let them cling to that absolute delusion for tonight. Tell them to present themselves at your downtown law office tomorrow morning at exactly 9 o'clock. If they are even 1 minute late, the offer is permanently rescinded and the immediate physical eviction proceeds without delay. Understood. Ms. Kensington replied, her fingers typing rapidly on her digital tablet. "And what exactly will this final agreement entail?" "It will contain absolutely zero emotion," I stated coldly. "No familial reconciliation, no forgiveness, and definitely no financial salvation. It will be pure black and white ink on legally binding paper. We will offer to restructure their massive, crippling bank fraud debt just enough to keep them out of a federal penitentiary, because I do not want the media circus of a criminal trial attached to my maiden name. In exchange, I want total, uncontested surrender of every single asset they possess. Prepare the documents tonight." Ms. Kensington turned on her heel and exited the office, heading straight for the ground floor. Through the high-definition security camera feed on my monitor, I watched the execution of my orders unfold in real time. The elevator doors opened in the lobby, and Ms. Kensington stepped out, looking like a terrifying corporate Grim Reaper. Richard and Susan immediately lunged forward, their faces lighting up with desperate, foolish hope as they saw an executive approaching the security barrier. Susan pressed her hands against the glass, her expensive mascara running down her cheeks in dark, messy streaks. "Oh, thank God," Susan cried out, her voice loud and frantic through the audio feed. "Did Chelsea send you? Is she going to wire the money to save our house? We knew she would not let her own flesh and blood freeze out here in the streets." Ms. Kensington stopped exactly 2 feet from the reinforced glass, looking down at my parents with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. She did not offer a handshake or a polite greeting. She simply looked at them as if they were a disgusting stain on the pristine marble floor. "My client, the Chief Executive Officer of Vanguard Forensic Accounting and the sole owner of Apex Holdings, has zero interest in hearing your apologies," Ms. Kensington announced, her voice projecting through the security intercom with terrifying robotic precision. "She will not see you. She will not speak to you. However, she has authorized me to offer you one final, extremely limited opportunity to negotiate an agreement regarding your catastrophic financial default." Richard frantically wiped the freezing rainwater from his eyes, his shoulders slumping in sheer relief. "Yes, absolutely yes," Richard stammered, completely abandoning any remaining shred of his former arrogant pride. "We will agree to whatever she wants. We just need the funds restored. Please tell us what we need to do." "You will present yourselves at my private legal firm tomorrow morning at exactly 9 o'clock. Ms. Kensington commanded, her tone slicing through their pathetic relief. "You will bring your state identification and nothing else. You will not bring your daughter Brittany, and you certainly will not bring your fraudulent son-in-law. This meeting is strictly for the primary debtors on the defaulted commercial loans. If you fail to appear, or if you arrive at 9 o'clock and 1 second, the county sheriff will arrive at your suburban property to forcefully remove your belongings to the curb. Do I make myself absolutely clear?" Susan nodded violently, her wet hair sticking to her face. "Yes, we understand. We will be there. Thank you. Please tell Chelsea thank you for saving us." Ms. Kensington let out a sharp, mocking scoff. She did not bother to correct their massive, foolish misconception. She simply turned her back on them and walked away, leaving them shivering in the freezing rain, blindly believing they had just secured a miraculous financial pardon. I sat in my office watching the security feed as Richard and Susan slowly turned and walked back out into the brutal Chicago storm. They were holding on to each other, falsely comforted by the delusion that they had successfully manipulated their successful daughter one last time. They had absolutely no idea that the final agreement waiting for them tomorrow morning was not a rescue boat. It was a legally binding guillotine meticulously designed to sever them from my life completely and permanently. I finished my dark coffee, feeling the absolute intoxicating thrill of total victory. The trap was perfectly set, and tomorrow I would finally close the heavy iron cage. The bright morning sun offered absolutely zero physical warmth as it reflected off the towering cold glass skyscrapers of downtown Chicago. Inside the top-floor conference room of Ms. Kensington's highly elite legal firm, the silent atmosphere was even colder. The room was a vast, sterile expanse of polished steel white leather chairs and a massive frosted glass table that felt more like an interrogation chamber than a meeting space. Exactly at 9 o'clock sharp, the heavy oak doors swung open. Richard, Susan, and surprisingly Brittany walked into the room. The sight of them was a breathtaking testament to how rapidly arrogance decays when stripped of its financial funding. They looked entirely unrecognizable. Richard wore a wrinkled, oversized gray sweater, his face pale and deeply lined with dark, hollow bags under his bloodshot eyes. Susan looked 10 years older, her usually immaculate blonde hair flat and unstyled, her hands trembling violently as she clutched a cheap generic handbag. Brittany was perhaps the most pathetic of them all. Her designer makeup was completely gone, revealing puffy, red-rimmed eyes and a deeply terrified expression. I sat at the head of the long glass table, my posture perfectly straight, flanked closely by Ms. Kensington. I did not offer them a seat. I did not offer them a single drop of water. I watched them shift uncomfortably under my freezing, analytical gaze. Brittany could not maintain eye contact for more than a fraction of a second. The reason for her absolute physical collapse was glaringly obvious, and my private investigator had confirmed the humiliating details just hours ago. Donovan had completely vanished. The moment the spectacular country club execution concluded, her smooth-talking, fraudulent husband had raced back to their rental property, packed a single duffel bag, emptied whatever microscopic amount of cash remained in Brittany's personal checking account, and fled the state. He abandoned his wife and his children without a single backward glance, leaving Brittany entirely to face the catastrophic financial wreckage he had orchestrated. Now she stood cowering behind her equally destroyed parents, a broken, discarded prop in a con game she had blindly defended. Richard placed his trembling hands flat on the cold glass table, leaning his weight forward as if his legs could no longer support his shrinking frame. "Chelsea, please," Richard begged, his voice a hoarse, rattling whisper that contained absolutely zero trace of the booming patriarch who had dominated my entire childhood. "We are completely destroyed." Donovan took the very last of the emergency cash and vanished into thin air. "We have nothing left. The bank accounts are frozen, the credit cards are entirely declined, and we cannot even afford to buy basic groceries. We came here because your security guard said you had an agreement. We will sign whatever you want, but please, I am begging you as a father, just let us keep the house. We can rent out the extra rooms, we can find minimum wage jobs, just do not throw us out onto the street." Susan fell to her knees right there on the pristine office carpet, sobbing loudly and clutching the edge of the conference table. She begged me to remember the good times, desperately fabricating memories of a loving childhood that never actually existed. I looked down at the woman kneeling on the floor, feeling absolutely nothing but a profound clinical detachment. I opened the sleek black leather folder resting in front of me and pulled out a single thick stack of heavily notarized legal documents. I slid them across the smooth glass surface until they stopped directly in front of Richard's trembling hands. "I am going to offer you a singular, highly generous legal miracle today, Richard," I stated, my voice echoing with brutal, undeniable authority. "My forensic accounting team has spent the last 48 hours auditing your loan applications. The documents you submitted to Vanguard National Bank contained massively inflated assets and deliberately falsified revenue projections. In the eyes of the federal government, that is textbook credit fraud. If I release this specific forensic audit to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, you and Susan will undoubtedly spend the next decade in a federal penitentiary. Richard gasped, clutching his chest as the terrifying reality of federal prison loomed directly over him. His breathing became incredibly shallow, his eyes darting frantically toward Miss Kensington, as if expecting federal agents to burst through the doors at any moment. "I am permanently erasing your commercial bank debt." I continued, speaking slowly, so every single devastating syllable landed perfectly. "Apex Holdings is formally absorbing the total loss of your massive margin call. You will not face federal indictment. You will not go to prison for fraud. You will walk out of this towering skyscraper today as entirely free citizens with absolutely zero negative balance attached to your legal names." A fleeting, pathetic wave of sheer relief washed over their haggard faces, but I immediately raised my hand, silencing their premature gratitude. However, I commanded, my tone dropping to absolute freezing zero. "That financial salvation comes with a mandatory, non-negotiable price. I am clearing the heavy debt, but I am permanently confiscating the associated collateral. You do not get to keep the sprawling suburban mansion. You do not get to keep the luxury vehicles currently parked in that massive driveway. Every single valuable asset, every piece of expensive furniture, and every piece of jewelry purchased with those fraudulent loans is now the exclusive legal property of my corporation. You have exactly 48 hours to pack your basic clothing and vacate my property. You will move into a cheap roadside motel or a basic rental apartment, and you will learn exactly how it feels to start from absolute nothing." Brittany let out a sharp, devastated wail, finally comprehending that her days of luxurious entitlement were permanently terminated. Richard stared at the legal documents, realizing he had absolutely no choice but to sign away his entire kingdom just to maintain his precious physical freedom. Ms. Kensington did not allow the suffocating silence in the conference room to linger. She reached into her pristine leather briefcase one final time and extracted a separate, significantly thicker stack of legal documents printed on heavy premium paper. She placed the imposing stack precisely in the dead center of the frosted glass table. The harsh fluorescent lights overhead reflected off the crisp white pages, illuminating the ultimate non-negotiable condition of their financial salvation. I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms on the table, locking my cold, analytical gaze onto the three shattered figures sitting opposite me. I watched the last remaining shreds of their arrogant suburban pride evaporate into the sterile, air-conditioned atmosphere. "You are going to walk away from those massive, fraudulent commercial loans without facing a federal grand jury indictment," I stated, my voice echoing with absolute terrifying clarity. "You will not be paraded through the local news in handcuffs. But that unprecedented level of legal mercy comes with a permanent, unbreakable chain. What sits in front of you is a comprehensive, ironclad, no-contact, non-disclosure agreement. It is the absolute final barrier separating your physical freedom from a lengthy, miserable stint in a federal penitentiary." Richard stared blindly at the thick stack of papers, his trembling hands refusing to reach out and touch them. Susan let out a pathetic, muffled sob, burying her face in her hands, completely unable to process the sheer magnitude of her own downfall. Brittany sat perfectly still, her eyes wide and vacant, completely traumatized by the rapid, brutal destruction of her entire privileged existence. I did not feel a single microscopic drop of pity for any of them. They had meticulously dug their own graves with years of vanity, cruelty, and boundless greed. Now I was simply handing them the shovels to finish the job. Ms. Kensington stepped forward, tapping her silver pen against the top page of the agreement, her voice ringing out like a judge delivering a final, inescapable sentence. "The terms outlined in this contract are absolute, immediate, and completely non-negotiable," the attorney commanded. By signing this binding legal instrument, you are agreeing to completely and permanently erase yourselves from the existence of my client and her minor son. You are explicitly forbidden from initiating any form of contact, be it physical, digital, or through any third-party intermediaries. You will not call. You will not send letters. You will not attempt to approach them in any public or private setting. I took over the explanation, ensuring they heard the specific boundaries directly from the daughter they had so callously discarded. There is a strict, legally enforced 500-yard proximity perimeter written into that contract, I declared, watching Richard flinch as the severe reality set in. If you ever attempt to approach me, or if you ever dare to come within 500 yards of my son Leo, my security team will not merely ask you to leave. They will immediately contact local law enforcement. You will be arrested for violating a standing protective order, and I will personally ensure the federal fraud files are immediately submitted to the authorities. You will completely vanish from our lives starting the very second you walk out of this building. Brittany let out a sharp, devastated gasp, finally finding her voice. But my social media. Brittany cried out, her priorities remaining sickeningly superficial even as her entire world burned to ashes. My friends, the neighborhood groups. How am I supposed to explain what happened without telling my side of the story? You do not have a side of the story anymore, I replied, slicing through her ridiculous complaint with a tone of pure, freezing ice. Section 4 of that agreement contains a comprehensive digital gag order. You are permanently banned from ever mentioning my name, my son's name, or my corporate entities on any social media platform, public forum, or private digital communication. You will not post about this transaction. You will not seek sympathy from your remaining country club acquaintances by playing the victim. If a single defamatory word regarding my life leaves your lips or your keyboards, a massive financial penalty will be instantly triggered. A penalty of exactly $1 million per verified violation payable immediately upon demand. The threat of $1 million penalty effectively crushed whatever microscopic defiance remained in their broken bodies. They had absolutely zero, capital zero leverage and zero alternatives. They were entirely, hopelessly cornered. Ms. Kensington placed 3 expensive silver pens next to the towering stack of documents, silently waiting for their inevitable submission. Richard reached out first. His hand shook so violently he could barely grip the smooth metal barrel of the pen. He pulled the document toward him, hot tears of utter humiliation pooling in his bloodshot eyes and dropping silently onto the crisp white paper. He was signing away his sprawling mansion, his luxury vehicles, his fake prestige, and the very daughter he had so arrogantly banished into the winter night. Susan followed suit, her weeping echoing pathetically through the sterile conference room as she blindly scrawled her signature across the dotted lines, completely surrendering her entire high society identity. Brittany signed last, her face pale and devoid of all expression, entirely defeated. When the final signature was applied, Richard slowly dropped the silver pen onto the glass table. It landed with a heavy, hollow clink. He did not look at his wife or his remaining golden child. He slowly raised his head, his eyes meeting mine. He looked utterly hollowed out, a completely empty shell of the tyrannical patriarch he used to be. "I never thought you could be this cruel, Chelsea." "Richard," whispered, his voice cracking painfully under the crushing weight of his absolute defeat. "I never imagined you possessed this kind of darkness inside you." I sat perfectly still, absorbing his pathetic, hypocritical accusation without feeling a single ounce of remorse. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the mahogany table, and delivered the ultimate fatal blow to his shattered ego. "I am not being cruel, Richard," I stated, my voice radiating absolute, unshakable power. "I am simply doing business. The weak, the incompetent, and the fake get systematically eliminated from the ecosystem. That is the harsh reality of the corporate world. You are the one who taught me that lesson 11 years ago, when you threw me and your disabled grandson out into the freezing cold. I was just an excellent student, and now the masterclass is officially over." I pushed my heavy leather chair back from the frosted glass table, the soft scrape against the floor, signaling the absolute end of the negotiation. I did not offer a parting glance to the broken figures sitting across from me. I did not wait for another desperate plea or a hollow, meaningless apology from the people who had tried to destroy me. I simply stood up, buttoned my tailored charcoal blazer, and walked toward the heavy oak doors of the conference room with perfect, unwavering posture. Behind me, the muffled sounds of Susan weeping and Richard breathing heavily faded into complete nothingness. Ms. Kensington remained at the table to process the signed documents, her sharp eyes ensuring they collected their minimal belongings and vacated the premises exactly as instructed. Stepping into the private elevator, I felt a physical suffocating weight completely vanish from my shoulders. It was a massive burden I had carried for 34 years, a toxic pressure to seek validation from people who were fundamentally incapable of providing it. The high-speed descent to the underground parking garage felt like returning from a lifelong, exhausting war. I had won the ultimate victory. I had fought a brutal battle against the very people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. I had protected my son, secured my financial empire, and permanently eradicated the disease that had plagued my existence. I slid behind the steering wheel of my custom black sport utility vehicle. The powerful engine roared to life with a quiet, satisfying hum. I navigated through the bustling streets of downtown Chicago, leaving the cold, rigid financial district behind and heading toward the serene, leafy neighborhoods of the northern suburbs. My destination was a highly specialized elite private academy designed specifically for gifted children with unique neurodivergent profiles. It was a brilliant environment that celebrated sensitive minds instead of trying to force them into rigid conventional boxes. I parked near the pristine front entrance and walked through the vibrant, colorful hallways. The sweet sound of children laughing and engaging in complex creative projects filled the air. There was no screaming, no judgment, and absolutely no one calling them defective or burdensome. I spotted Leo in the outdoor sensory garden. He was completely absorbed in constructing an intricate, massive architectural model, using magnetic blocks, his face glowing with pure, unadulterated joy. His teacher stood nearby, praising his incredible spatial awareness and advanced problem-solving skills. When Leo saw me approaching, his eyes lit up brighter than the sun. He dropped his blocks and ran across the soft synthetic grass, launching himself directly into my waiting arms. I caught him holding his small, warm body tightly against my chest. I buried my face in his hair, inhaling the sweet, familiar scent of my beautiful boy. "I am right here, sweet boy," I whispered, feeling an overwhelming surge of fierce, protective love. "We are completely safe now. Nobody is ever going to yell at you again. You are absolutely perfect, exactly the way you are, and I will spend the rest of my life making sure you always know that." The transition from that freezing, turbulent winter into a bright, magnificent spring was the most beautiful season of my entire life. I stood on the expansive cedar deck of my own private estate, holding a glass of sparkling water, looking out over my lush, manicured backyard. It was a flawless Saturday afternoon. The air was filled with the mouth-watering scent of grilled cedar plank salmon and the rich sound of genuine, unfiltered laughter. This was not a stiff, pretentious gathering at a snobby country club filled with fake smiles, endless judgment, and hollow boasts about imaginary wealth. This was a true, vibrant celebration of my chosen family. My top data analysts were clustered around the custom outdoor kitchen, enthusiastically debating sports statistics, while flipping burgers and sharing stories from their week. Miss Kensington was relaxing in a comfortable wicker lounge chair, having completely traded her terrifying courtroom suits for a casual linen dress, smiling warmly as she shared a fascinating legal anecdote with my chief of security. Several parents from Leo's academy were chatting cheerfully near the shallow end of the sparkling swimming pool. They were compassionate people who understood the unique challenges and absolute brilliance of raising neurodivergent children. They offered unwavering support, deep empathy, and fierce, unconditional loyalty. Leo was currently sprinting across the bright green lawn, with three of his classmates chasing a brightly colored water balloon, his laughter ringing out loud and clear across the yard. He was absolutely thriving, surrounded entirely by adults who nurtured his brilliant mind and children who accepted him exactly as he was. He was finally experiencing the pure, uncomplicated childhood he truly deserved, far away from the toxic expectations of my former relatives. I took a slow, deep breath of the warm, fresh air, feeling the gentle, healing sunlight on my face. I looked around at the incredible, vibrant community I had meticulously built around us. I had spent so many agonizing years believing that blood dictated loyalty, that sharing a last name somehow obligated me to endure endless psychological torment, public humiliation, and financial manipulation from people who only cared about themselves. But standing here watching my son smile with absolute unburdened freedom, I finally understood the profound, undeniable truth about human connection. Family is not defined by biology or strict legal documents. Family is defined by the people who fiercely protect your peace, the people who celebrate your victories without a single ounce of jealousy, and the people who stand firmly by your side when the darkest storms arrive. I raise my glass slightly, offering a silent, private toast to the incredible, limitless future stretching out before us. The long, exhausting nightmare was completely over. I had successfully severed the chains that bound me to a past filled with pain and inadequacy. The empire was entirely secure, and the ultimate lesson was permanently learned. When you finally find the courage to take the scalpel and cut out a deeply toxic, malignant tumor, the rest of your body can finally truly live. The most profound lesson from this journey is that biology does not automatically entitle anyone to your life, your resources, or your peace. We are often conditioned to accept mistreatment simply because it comes from blood relatives. However, true family is not defined by shared DNA or superficial social status. It is defined by unconditional support, mutual respect, and genuine love. Tolerating emotional abuse only breeds further disrespect. When you finally find the courage to establish absolute boundaries and remove toxic individuals from your environment, you do not lose a family. You simply clear the necessary space to truly thrive. Please share your own experiences in the comments below if you have ever had to permanently cut ties with toxic relatives to protect your peace.